2022 meeting of the Anacortes Planning Commission. Looking at the screen, we have 6 of our commissioners present. Has everybody had a chance to review the minutes from February 23rd? Any questions or additions? And then being heard, we'll move on to correspondence and announcements. Mr. Meismer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So as you all know, the mask mandate ends on March 12th of this year, and we have a special meeting with the Planning Commission set for March 16th. That meeting on March 16th will be a hybrid meeting, so in person and virtual. So please feel free to show up in the City Council chambers. The community is welcome as well. And you, based on the mask mandate, will not have to wear a mask, but if you feel you want to, that's okay as well. And for those of you who haven't signed up yet, Mayor Miller will be presenting the State of the City tomorrow between 11:30 and 1 o'clock in the council chambers, and you can get tickets at the door or sign up online at the chamber. And that's all I have this evening, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, sir. Is there any new business?
No new business.
We'll proceed with the continuation of the public hearing for the Floodplain Management Code amendments to the Anacortes Municipal Code, Chapter 19.74. Do we have a staff presentation?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So the commissioners have seen the draft amendments to Title 1974 a couple of times already. And this evening, we're presenting the second draft, and it should, I'm hoping, be the draft that is recommended to move on to City Council. And with it, you know, the various changes that we have conducted are compliant with David Radebaum, our city's floodplain management representative from Ecology, and he represents the National Flood Insurance Program as well. And we also have in our packet the Coastal Geologic Services report regarding sea level rise and a copy of the Port Townsend Code regarding their floodplain management regulations, which, you know, in our past meetings with the Planning Commission, the commissioners asked for a little bit more information on the sea level rise. And we had talked about the current requirement by Fema and the NFIP for 1 foot above the base flood elevation, which is, you know, that's a base throughout the country. Some jurisdictions go with 2 foot based on the sea level rise reports for their jurisdictions. So there are changes to definitions such as floodplain, flood elevation study, highest adjacent grade, new construction, substantial improvement. There's clarity for variance review criteria, special standards for residential construction and non-residential construction, and the amendments address appurtenant structures, detached garages, small structures, etc. And again, all of these changes are those that are required by the National Insurance Program through Ecology with David Radebaum. With that, I'd like to introduce Mr. Rob Freisinger. Rob is our deputy building official and has done a great job doing some research on sea level rise for the Anacortes, Flago Island area. Rob, all yours.
Alrighty. Yeah, I guess I've got a little slideshow for you that I hope can help answer some questions. So let's see if we can share my screen. And let's see. Righty. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about sea level rise. And can you all see my slide that says sea level rise? Okay. Awesome. Well, I want to start out by saying, you know, I like to take my kids to the beach. They get wet regardless of the weather, looking at squishy things in tide pools, throwing sticks in the water as flotillas of boats, hunting for shell middens and unknown archaeological wonders, and making sandcastles. Half the time the tide's coming in, and the waves chase succeeding series of buildings up the beach. Moats are dug, berms are built, hard armoring of shells and stones will briefly part the waves, but the sandcastles always come down as the tide comes in. Now, they haven't tried building sandcastles on sticks yet. That might be the secret to keeping them from going down. Sea level rise has three variables: quantity, probability, and location. I picked this particular slide because I figured the owner of the building would not sue me for showing sea level in relation to their building. This particular image would be if we had 16 feet of sea level rise combined with a storm event, which nobody expects to happen. But once I made the picture, I'm like, hey, this is going to grab people's attention. So we're going with it. But it's not likely. But the real question is, when you get into quantity of sea level rise, Don mentioned earlier, thinking about 2 feet as a freeboard level. The reason for that is the level of sea level rise is basically there's a wide variety of possibilities and percentages of possibilities. The lowest possible is right around 9 inches or a little less than a foot. Middle of the road is between 1 and 2 feet, and the not very likely but possible is right around 5 feet. For the next 20 or for the next 30 years are equivalent to a typical mortgage. All but the most extreme scenarios project a 1 foot of rise or less, and the extreme scenarios only call for 1.5 feet of rise. That's over the next 30 years. The graph I've got up right now takes it out through the end of the century, which is about how long I would expect a new building to last. Now there's all those the possibilities. So then we want to bring in probability, which is how likely is it for things to take place. So now, when we look at that, the highest probability, it's guaranteed to happen. We're going to see at least a foot of rise. That's the 80 to 85% probability range. We've got a 30 to 55% likelihood of a 2 foot rise. And then we're getting down into the pretty low levels of like 15% or lower chance of a 3 foot or greater rise in sea level. So if we put our probability and our quantity together, we can see that sort of the middle of the road range is the 2 foot range. Now the next question is, where is this going to take place? Obviously it's going to happen at the seashore, but where does that interface with our city? Our current flood zones, let's see. Bing. Now we got our current flood zones are shown in that bottom map in red to really stand out. And in that's the FEMA flood insurance rate map regulated flood zone area, by the way, which is a little bit different than what might get wet if water came up. It's the portion that we regulate. Now, flood zones measure something different than sea level rise does. Flood zones measure what you have when you have, the sun and the moon conspire to give you an extra high tide, and then you get on top of that a storm that's pushing, either with storm surge from low pressure or simply waves coming in, pushing the water up high on the beach. So one's a specific event in time and the other's an overall change. Now, the thing that I noticed when we had a previous meeting where we had a consultant come in was that really the sea level rise was measured differently than how the flood maps are measured. And that drove me to try to make a new map, which is in the bottom of this one underneath my cursor there. I cobbled together a bunch of D-firms or digital firm maps, took a digital highlighter and basically sharpied in where some sea level rise maps that NOAA provided showed up. And, you know, it worked for sitting in my office and trying to understand where sea level rise could affect the town. But it didn't strike me as very professional, honestly, and not something that was suitable for an outward presentation. So I contacted NOAA about, in essence, what they had or how they could help me come up with a better map. And so I had a meeting with 2 mapping specialists and then 2 social scientists where we put our heads together and came up with a game plan for creating a sea level rise map for the Anacortes area specifically. And what they did was they gave me access to their mapping layers that I could bring into our GIS system and create a map that illustrated where sea level rise could affect the town in a way that you can turn on and off layers, picking different levels. The meeting we had was kind of crazy. You know, the takeaway was that there's a 4-foot difference between how the flood zone maps measure thing and how modern surveyors do it. And kind of none of that really meshed with anything else. So what I did was I combined it. And so I came up with a series of maps that I don't know what your access level is on our GIS, and I haven't made it live to the entire public yet. But we have a map system where you can pick out a point in town and say, okay, I want to see what this looks like with 1 foot of sea level rise. And what I have illustrated is actually 1 foot of sea level rise combined with our flood zone level, using a 100-year flood event as the beginning point of that. And what that shows, let's see if I've got these marked. I'm going to say I got everybody's windows in front of my little note, so I can't read my screen. But anyways, the map in the upper corner here, you can see there's a skyline neighborhood. I believe this one is 2 foot of sea level rise combined with a storm event. Now, our storm events are, our 100-year storm event is equal to about 4 feet of sea level rise for a normal tide. So this would be the equivalent of a storm event with 2 feet of sea level rise on top of it. And there's a blue area kind of low where there's a large building right now, and that is a likely to get wet in a significant storm event if we have 2 feet of sea level rise. The brown areas, or the kind of orangey tan areas, are areas that might get wet, and it really gets down to how accurate the LiDAR is that they use for mapping the elevations there. There weren't very many parts of town that had a real significant area of sea level rise impact. Mostly it's skyline, a little bit of the kind of north end of the downtown area, and running up from the marina that's, you know, east of City Hall, going north by the wastewater treatment plant. There's sort of a low spot that Cap Santa used to be an island before they filled in that area. And so that area of fill is all a little bit low.
Hey, Rob, before you move on, can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah, by all means.
Okay, so you're using the term, you're using the term 2 feet of rise, 4 feet of rise in relation to flood zone levels and storm surges. How does that relate to BFE? Because I think when we come down to it, right, we're going to be making a decision on what additional rise do we want to make to the current BFE, right? And so I just want to make sure we're clear on the terms, and we're talking apples to apples.
Yes. And when I say 100-year storm event, or sort of mention that kind of terminology, that's our BFE level, is a 100-year event. So when I'm saying sea level rise, in addition to a storm event, that's basically BFE plus something to account for sea level rise. Because where it gets a little bit weird is that the base flood elevation is about 4 feet higher than the ordinary high water mark. So your base flood elevation is basically 4 feet above where the sea level currently rises to normally. But we can have events in which various forces will bring the water up a little bit higher, and so that's that 4 foot difference there. So when I say sea level rise, I'm basically stacking that on top of your BFE.
So the maps then that we're looking at here, that's BFE plus sea level rise plus additional 1 or 2 foot above that.
No, the upper sort of center map here is BFE plus 2 feet. Is what that's at. That's 2 feet, or BFE plus 2.
Mr. Chair, if I might.
Go ahead, Mr. Meismer.
Thanks. So, Rob, remind us, if I remember correctly, our base elevation, not base flood elevation, but base elevation that we work off of is NAVDAD 88. And that determines, based on our firm mapping, the elevation above that of 1 foot minimum for our firm maps. Is that correct?
The firm maps are in the NGVD 29.
29. Thank you.
So, but modern surveyors use the other one, the 88 one.
Right.
I've got a note here somewhere. But yeah, so there is a difference there. And yeah, so the FEMA maps use the NGVD 29, which is different from the one you just mentioned by basically 4 feet. As it describes the same level, but it uses a different datum. So that makes it, in that case, you are comparing apples to oranges. You're all talking about fruit, but nobody knows what you're eating. I got together with Noah to try to look at how our FEMA maps tie in with sea level rise. If that makes sense now. So it is, so the map I have displayed is BFE plus 2. Does that make sense there? To the sense that alphabet soup numbers of datum and whatnot get kind of sketchy.
So getting back to for the apples to apples comparison, both the NOAA map that you show below and then the more blown up one that's above, those are in context to BFE plus 2. So the highlighted areas in red and the various colors of mustard and whatever are the areas that would be impacted with an event that was BFE plus 2.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
Thank you.
All righty. Yeah, when I got together with the NOAA folks, we spent about an hour, and they were kind enough to provide a transcript of the meeting to me, and it's 99% jargon, and it gets difficult to track on what you're all talking about. But But so I want to point out that King County has chosen to look at sea level rise by raising the required freeboard. They do two things. They raise the required freeboard by 3 feet, and they also created an additional zone inland of where the flood zone ends. And we're not proposing to create an additional zone. We're just, right now, we're looking at raising the freeboard. King County added the additional zone inland because they said, you know what, water's going to flow inland. So the maps I showed you, that's BFE +2, we're not really looking, when we say +2, we're looking at only inside the existing firm or flood zone boundaries. We're not looking at expanding those boundaries outwards at this point in time. Most of our shoreline is also steep enough that the required setbacks, because we don't let people build right on the beach, the required setbacks, which even in the skyline area, which is the smallest setback, is 25 feet. And if you go 25 feet back from the water line, the ground slopes up enough that you're outside of the flood zone. So I've got a little illustration that shows King County's version, shows elevated buildings outside of the flood zone. Our version would be, if you're outside of the flood zone, you build whatever elevation you want to build. If you're inside the flood zone, we're looking at bumping it up to 2 feet. Is our preference level above the base flood elevation. It's currently 1 foot. And I took some steps of where we have basically that shows the flood zone as well as kind of some lots so you can get an idea of where the flood zone is. And in the lower left-hand corner, it's a series of lots along, I'm going to say, I think it's Skyline Way. Actually, no, it's Flounder Bay Road. I can see a little bit of that there. Anyways, it's in the Skyline neighborhood, right along next to where there's some condos, the ones that get great pictures taken of them with the waves crashing over the top during storm events. And I picked that picture because it shows that there's a little tiny blue line down here, if you can see that near my cursor. And that is a measurement point from the, what we would describe as the ordinary high water mark to the edge of the flood zone. And it's a little under 19 feet. The closest you could build there anyways would be 25 feet back. So any building on that particular location would be outside of the flood zone. So it wouldn't be affected by any current changes in rules. I went to the opposite side of town, picked the far side of Cap Sane, where there's a lot that's buildable, and the flood zone boundary is the dark blue line here. And the kind of, I don't know, tealy aqua stuff is flood area or water. And in essence, all the buildable area is outside of the flood zone. About the only spots I could find that were within the actual flood zone and would be affected by things was over at Lovericks, which at some point in time will end up being redeveloped. It's begging for something else there. And there's some property there that and the maps are not all that good. You can see the dark blue line here is the assumed shoreline, which doesn't match up real well with the actual shoreline. That's based on the firm maps. And then the other line here is the actual edge of the flood zone. So there is some buildable land there that could end up being affected by a requirement to raise things up an additional foot beyond the foot that we currently have them up.
So as if I understand what you just said, then you just pointed us out the three most concerning areas in the city of Anacortes for a possible flood zone event that are the only three areas that would be impacted by this BFE+2 change. And you're basically making an argument suggesting that it's insignificant, that BFE+2 probably wouldn't have any impact on any of those buildable lots. Is that a reach?
Well, the BFE+2 would not have an impact on a large number of lots based on the current firm maps that we have. Now, they're in the process of redoing the firm maps, and that could change that. But I don't have
should we be concerned? Maps. Should we be concerned at all about making a recommendation to City Council of making what could, be based on the current data that we have on these firm mats? If there was a substantial change in these firm mats, the decisions that we make or that City Council makes based on these older maps could have a huge impact, right? Wouldn't it make sense for us to wait until these new firm maps are available before we make a recommendation to City Council on what we should do with BFE?
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
So that's a great question, Mr. Graff. First of all, those firm maps have been in play now for 8 years at least. And we have no idea when the new firm maps may be adopted. As I understand it right now, they're not really even working on them. And it all has to do with issues with the Skagit River. So, we have no idea when they're going to be adopted. What we're looking at is what we have before us based on the older maps, that we should probably be thinking about about sea level rise for some event that may happen between now and new maps that we don't know when are going to be coming forward. When those new maps come forward, they'll have to be adopted by City Council. And so there'll be a lot of discussion on that with the community, City Council, and the Planning Commission. And at that time, and they could decide at that time to say, no, we're not going to go. We want to change the code and not have an additional foot. But we don't know until those maps are adopted. And yes, those maps, I have seen the drafts, and they will have some significant changes for Fidalgo Island.
I mean, everything that we're talking about here today is based on probabilities. What are the probabilities of having this 30-year, 100-year storm event? 16 feet, and we wash away City Hall. The probabilities of these firm mats coming anytime sooner than 10 years or 12 years from now. Right? This is all based on probability, and yet, the next thing I was going to ask is, what's the life cycle of a decision that gets made today, not being changed in 4 or 8 years when the next administration comes? But I don't want to take any more time. I apologize for getting stuck on a.
No. Well, so, an individual in the community can make a recommendation for a development regulation change, which includes floodplain management regulation change, before March 31st of every year. City staff can bring a recommendation before City Council and the Planning Commission at any time of the year. So, if something comes up where the community and or commissioners and council feels that we should change something, we can bring that before council almost any time.
Dr. Orton, I see you have your hand up.
Thanks. So knowing what we know now, given the maps that we have now, I think I read that there's about 30 lots, most of them undeveloped. Is that correct? That would be impacted by moving this up a foot?
No, that is if the 30 lots are if in essence, if we expanded the flood zone to incorporate things landward of where it is right now. based on sea level rise. So in essence, if the water came up, what would get wet would be about 30 lots. But what we're in essence asking today is looking at just what is within the current flood zone. So we're not looking at moving the flood zone based on, when you look at a topographical map and there's all the lines and they would march inland from the sea, we're not looking at bringing those to match those elevation lines. We're just drawing an imaginary line straight up from the current flood zone boundary and saying, look, things inside the flood zone, we want to bring up a little bit.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was I worked on the slides for this after I had done the initial document that you're referencing there, and I picked some of the drawings that show where the flood zone actually is to try to emphasize that, because after reading it, I felt that it was a little bit confusing how I had it written up. But the final thing we talked about, and Jeff asked about, probability. What's the likelihood of that? And I pulled all my information from the University of Washington. Has a climate change program that's gathered huge amounts of information. And I'm a Husky, so I'm biased towards information from the UW. Full confession there. I actually took at least one oceanography class. I might have taken two, but it was a really long time ago, and I can't remember anymore. But anyways, in probability, there's a really high probability we're going to have at least 1 foot of sea level rise. There is a moderate probability that we're going to have at least 2 feet of sea level rise. In the sea level rise chart on the left, they have it divided by probabilities. The column in this left-hand map, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but underneath where my cursor is, there's a column that's numbers, and it's probabilities of things. And I picked the 50th percentile, the first, and the 99th. For the 99% probability is it's all but guaranteed to happen. The 50% probability is it's like a coin toss. It's about 50% likelihood of happening. And then the 1% is very unlikely. It's 1% chance that it's going to be 5 feet, and it's 99% chance it's not going to be 5 feet. So when we're looking at probability, the reason why I think that the 2 foot level is a reasonable thing is it's really middle of the road. It doesn't currently impact a large number of lots, because I think that's something to be cognizant of. But it's moving in the right direction, and it's moving everything up.
Mr. Frissinger, I had a question about the underlying data used to develop these probabilities. What does the RCP mean?
That is carbon. It's level of carbon in the atmosphere. So I know the C is carbon, P particulate, and no idea what the R stands for, honestly. That's
all right. It's based on the projections of carbon in the global warming models. Is that correct?
Yes. And so two different sets of data for a high carbon projection and a low carbon.
And those are based on what assumptions?
That I would have to dig to, in essence, the base data further to answer that. My general understanding is that the low one is, we do all the switch to electric cars and stop burning coal and all that. And the high one is we continue with the current levels. But that's condensing a whole bunch of information into one thing and oversimplifying it.
So the probabilities that you're calculating here are dependent on the assumptions that are made about carbon in the atmosphere out 80 years, and what other assumptions are built into that? I mean, it's not an area of my study, but I see 3 very different projections here.
Well, yes.
And what makes those projections different?
Oh, the difference in the projections is really in the probability that they're looking at. There's orange sort of spectrum projections and there's blue projections there. What I would say is if you look at the 50 percentile projection in both the high carbon and the low carbon assessment, I'm going to say one's like 1'3" thereabouts, 1'3", and the other is about 1'9". So there's about a 6-inch difference in that one between the high and the low. And I'm eyeballing this as an old school carpenter, but there's more like a 6 to 9-inch spread in the 1% chance of it happening, and probably closer to a 3-inch spread in the you're all but guaranteed to have it happen. So the reason why there's 3 different distinct line tracks is those are looking at different probabilities rather than carbon levels. Did that help?
Not at all.
Well, at least that's an honest answer.
Yeah, let's answer a really simple question, and hopefully there's a simple answer. Projecting out 30 years and 50 years, what's the probability of more than a 1-foot rise in sea level? If I'm reading this chart right, it looks like it's 1%.
If you run out, let's see. Are you looking at the image on the right?
No, I'm looking at the one on the left.
The one on the left. Okay, so in 50 years, so we're looking at 20, the probability of a 1-foot rise, if I'm running across, is right around 50%.
Okay, and then what about above 1 foot?
Above 1 foot, if it's a 2-foot rise in 50 years, that's sort of the 1% variable.
Okay, that's all the answer I needed. Thank you.
Yeah, and so the one thing that when I think of buildings, though, I don't think out 30 years. I think out 70, 80 years.
Dr. Martin, do you have your hand up again? Please go ahead.
Yes. Your question about the underlying assumptions on this data, these data is important. It looks like they are also based on, I guess, actual carbon emissions from 1991 to 2009. Is that correct?
That I would have an answer. I don't know off the top of my head.
As I look at, it looks like the same sort of models from this Coastal Geologic Services, and they quoted from some other organization. Let's see here. They quoted from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. IPCC, and they have wildly different projections. I mean, wildly different. So it's almost like roll the dice kind of guessing, it looks like to me. This IPCC says with low greenhouse gases, a rise of 11 inches. Well, I guess that's not so different. Up to almost 40 inches with the high.
There is a wide range.
And that's the basis of my question. I'm accustomed to looking at charts with trends, and they're usually based on actual data so that you can see where the data is trending to. These are based on a wide range of guesses or projections based on a number of assumptions that may or may not be in effect by the time you get to that point in the graph on the timeline. I mean, for example, I have no doubt that warming is occurring, and the rise in sea level appears to be related to that. But the extent to which it occurs, or the projections about the extent that it's going to occur, seem to have some pretty broad stretches here. And I'm not sure if we're qualified to make that kind of decision. I mean, this is a wild-ass guess. The projections based on nothing changing and mankind continuing to pollute the atmosphere versus solving all the problems and not doing anything are based on human behavior in the future. And how are we going to know what that likelihood is? The probabilities here are based on somebody else's projections. So it's really hard to say that something is a 50% probability, since I don't know what the underlying assumptions or what the future behavior is going to be. And if this isn't going to affect too many properties, it's going to affect somebody, and it's going to cost somebody money, one way or the other.
Yeah.
I don't want to be making a wild ass guess based on this kind of data, frankly. Unless somebody knows a lot more than I do about it.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, Mr. Mono.
Yes, part of my concern with this is, and I was involved in some of the early discussions with the King County case and that additional zone. We tend to, at that point in time, focus too much on the sea level rise and the new elevation base. The issue is in terms of impact, and I'm trying to address that impact question, is the water coming off of the upland areas into the impact zone of the sea level rise and the 100-year event or 200-year event has nowhere to go. And so it spreads. And so the impact zone is actually larger than what most people tend to want to define it to be. Because the water must go somewhere, but it cannot simply flow because everything is higher, everything is bigger. There's just simply more water in the system. And so you've got to be much more cautious, I believe, in trying to define what that impact zone really is.
Ms. Ruther.
Kind of along everyone's comments. I mean, I think global warming is coming. I mean, I agree, and I don't know that getting bogged down in details helps, but from like a policy standpoint, and I don't know if Mr. Miesmer can answer this. Like, I'd like to see what, like, it's a very small area, so honestly, it's like, what exactly does does this get us, and what are the costs? Like, I'm trying to understand, like, getting bogged down in details. Even if we did pass this, like, what benefit is it, and who does it cost? Like, what does it cost them, and does it ruin people's views? It's hard to. I would like to, like, get a better sense of. I mean, I don't, you know, none of us are climate scientists or know what went into models or whatever, but I mean, disregarding that, I'm having a hard time even understanding, like, trying to get it down to Anacortes of what this matters for us. It's a very small area of properties, and I don't understand even for them what it would cost them versus what the benefit for us would be of, like, does it mean, how does, as a city, as it save us too? So that might be, if you could, if it's some kind of a pro and con to take the discussion there of, like, what exactly could an estimate, what exactly would it cost? How much more would it cost to build a building? And would it ruin someone's views? That would be a question I would have of whether this is worth it for us. It seems a very small area to be worrying about at this point. I don't know. And I know I think the example was given for Port Townsend, but it sounds like their city as a much level lower than us. So I'm not sure that they're necessarily parallel example to us.
Mr. Chair, I can answer a little bit of
Mr.
that.
Meisner.
So thinking back to the 2016 comprehensive plan, it does direct us to take climate change, global warming into account when we're looking at our Shorelines Master Program and our Floodplain Management Code. And so, you know, that's, you know, what we're trying to do here. And I realize that there is a ton of different studies on climate change, global warming, sea level rise, and there isn't anything out there that is consistent. They're all different. And so that makes it more difficult for you and for us to try and get you the information to work from. As far as cost, and Rob, you might be able to weigh in here too. Cost, I can't imagine that it's going to be that much more. What you're talking about here is your foundation and your floor level being an additional foot beyond the foot that's going to already be required. And then when we come to building height, your maximum height anywhere in the city of Anacortes, well, in residential zones, excuse me, is 35 feet. And so a person on the shoreline could build up to 35 feet. Whether that's going to block somebody's view, it very well could. But the additional 1 foot or 2 foot, that's not going to make that really that much difference, in my opinion. And so what we're coming down to here is, you know, the floodplain management code is to help protect property and life. And the 1 foot above base flood elevation is guaranteed. The 2 foot is if the planning commission feels comfortable recommending that to the city council, then, you know, we could go there and then have that conversation with city council as well. And again, I fully understand there is so much out there right now on global warming and sea level rise and climate change that trying to ferret out what really is the point is very difficult. I like what Mr. Molyneux said in the fact that as we consider climate change and global warming, it's where the water goes that is upland with the more storm events, the larger storm events that we're having. All of that rain's got to go somewhere. It's going to be going into the sea, into the ocean. And that's what we're hearing. But again, honestly, I don't have the scientific data to tell you one way or the other what the best approach is. And honestly, you know, we brought in Geological Services and had them give us some information, but their information is even different from what you can get from the University of Washington. So which one do you actually believe? You know, hard to say. So yeah, it's a flip of the coin right now, and I apologize for putting the commissioners on that spot.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Riff.
Hey, Quite frankly, I think that the devil is in the details, and I think it's important for us to understand where we're basing these decisions on and the data that went into these graphs. You know, if it's 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s, perceptions of where we're going with global warming and what we're doing as a world, country, what have you, to try to combat that, then your impression should be don't go out further than about 50 years, and perhaps maybe these graphs will actually start sloping to the other side because of the impacts that we're making and the corrections that we're making. Mr. Meisner, specifically to 35-foot building heights, you know, it's usually that's based on the highest point of the property. You go up 35 feet from there, roughly. Correct me if I'm wrong, but what impact would having to build a house 2 feet higher or 1 foot higher would have on? Are you now only limited to a 33-foot, to keep the math simple, tall home now? Is that what?
So if I might, actually, Anacortes code describes height not from the highest point of the property, although that's how Skyline addresses it. The Anacortes code addresses it from an average of the tallest point of the structure at the front of the building, typically. And so it would be averaged between all the points at the front of the building instead of at the highest point of the lot. 35 foot, you know, as it stands right now, the 1 foot is a guaranteed, that 1 foot above base flood elevation has to be in our code. The National Flood Insurance Program would not accept our flood code management if it wasn't. That's required by FEMA and by NFIP.
I'm not suggesting that we do away with the BFE plus 1, and I'm not even suggesting that we don't consider the BFE plus 2. I'm just trying to get a clarification on the impact as a home builder. I think for my lot, when I built my home, we were 35 foot from the highest point. I live kind of in the Skyline area, so I think that's where we made that. And I do have a view lot, and I know I'm impacting the people that live behind me. So, yeah.
So you know, Mr. Graff, you're right. In Skyline, it's typically 14 foot from the highest point of the lot, but we, the city does not administer their covenants, bylaws, or restrictions, and so we always look at it from the average at the topography near the building. But how's that going to impact the homes around them and the folks? Yeah, you know, their floor is going to have to be a foot higher, and so when it comes right down to it, from the envelope of that building, from their floor to the peak of that roof, instead of being 30 feet, might only be 29 feet. So it could very well impact that envelope of their house by 1 foot. Yes, that's true.
And I think Gary brings up a good point too, because right now we seem to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, Gary, but I think we seem to be focused on shoreline. And I think he's kind of thinking more about what happens with some of the, if you go back to the maps, the lakes that we have in the ACFL perhaps, and what looks to be the swelling of those lakes, and where does the water go? Does it run down into residential areas now? I believe that might be addressed in the document that we were asked to review, where it talks about if a BFE is not available, then the structure is expected to be 2 feet higher than the adjacent highest point or something to that effect. Mr. Meisner, can you help me understand that?
That's correct. They take adjacent grade level at that point.
Yes, okay.
It's also good to note that, you know, most of all of our lakes, in fact, I think all of them, are in the forest lands and they don't have ability to build structures near them. But where there are some issues is the outfalls from various lakes and where those go and how those impact areas around them. And those actually are, those areas are shown on the firm maps.
Yeah, one of the maps that Rob showed us, I think, shows some runoff going into the residences there off of D Avenue, the upper side of D Avenue. Right, okay.
Correct.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Chair, if I might make a couple of comments here. Just to note that the public comment period has been open on this since July 28th. We had a planning commission meeting on August 27th, October 27th, and then of course this evening. We've not received any public comments on these at all. And the commissioners could very well close the public hearing this evening, deliberate, and recommend something to the city council. And certainly, if the commissioners aren't comfortable with recommending an additional foot above base flood elevation for potential sea level rise, we could move the body of the regulations forward and get those done so that the Department of Ecology is comfortable with what we've adopted, and then come back and continue our discussion on sea level rise and acquire more information, perhaps even bring someone in from the University of Washington to have a better conversation with us on that. Or if not the University of Washington, Western Washington, Getting at you there, Rob.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm a Husky through and through. The Vikings are closer.
So it's up to the commissioners on how you'd like to proceed on this. We've been at this for a while. Department of Ecology would like to have this finished up. So if we drop the sea level rise issue at this point, move the body of the regulations forward without that additional foot, that satisfies the Department of Ecology, and then we can come back and have a more broad conversation on sea level rise if you like.
So I'm a little unclear about what that does to the AMC changes. Are you proposing that not suggesting that we do this, but do I understand that you're saying we could forward this to the city council without a particular recommendation on this one point?
That's correct, Mr. Chair, yes. Right now, the way that the amendments are set up is to identify all the changes necessary from the Department of Ecology and the National Flood Insurance Program. The sea level rise component is just an add-on and is not required by the Department of Ecology nor by any other RCW or anything like that.
I guess I'm curious if any of the commissioners are convinced one way or the other, and we should also at least open for public comment and conclude the hearing portion. Do we have anyone? Yes?
Just to make sure that I'm understanding, when we say potentially forward this to council, would they receive the same briefing, the same presentation, and the same materials that we were presented with this evening?
Yes, they will.
Okay. And then the second question I had was the possibility of forwarding this to council without the sea level rise language. Is that a temporary solution, or is that a temporary situation, or can that be ad infinitum? There never has to be a sea level. And the reason why I asked that is for some of the comments that have come up. I do believe the sea levels are rising. I think I agree with most people why they are, but I also really believe that it's super hard to figure out how fast and by when, and it is at some point going to cost somebody money. And it may not be me or it may not be anybody here, but it's going to cost somebody money. And we're kind of throwing a dart at the dartboard. So my question is, I'm not a biologist, I'm not an earth scientist, but I'm not dumb. This presentation didn't really hit with me. It didn't really connect. There was a lot of questions that I don't think were answered. So my concern would be if this is the packet and if this is the brief that would go to council, I have a feeling they're going to ask a lot of the same questions and probably find themselves at the same inflection point that we are.
Mr. Chair, if
Mr.
you'd like,
Molyneux
I
had his hand up. Go
okay.
ahead.
Mr. Chair, the issue of sea level rise. I guess I'm somewhat jaded on this point after a webinar I did this afternoon with the Atmospheric Sciences Department at a major university. It's not one of these little ones around here, but University of Illinois. And the issue is they've been working on this issue since 1976. And they have used probably 100 different methodologies to address the research questions surrounding this point. I guess the point of it is that while all of the methodologies are different, the conclusion is actually pretty much the same. Sea levels are rising. Whether they're rising 1 foot or 2 foot doesn't really make a difference. If we adopt one, it's going to cost somebody something if we've made a mistake. If we adopt another, it's going to cost somebody. From a public policy point of view, I'm not sure that we're in a position in the next meeting or the next 100 meetings to come up with a definitive conclusion about justifying a 1 foot or a 2 foot rise. And I think we should listen to what the public has got to say through the public hearing process, and then it behooves us to make a decision, move forward. It doesn't mean that it's an absolute decision. We can always come back and readdress that question as we want. But again, just letting this thing churn to what end, I'm not sure what the end game is.
Mr. Chair, if I may,
Mr. Mazur.
a suggestion. It's entirely within the Planning Commissioner's realm to recommend to the City Council approval of the development regulation amendments as presented without sea level rise, and request that the Planning Commission have opportunities to further review the sea level rise issue over the coming months. And that way we can get the rest of those regulations in place and working consistent with the NFIP guidelines and Fema, and then come back with more information on sea level rise, because I think that's probably, as you all mentioned, a broader community conversation that, as you can see from this evening's meeting and others, we really haven't had the community present at these meetings. And so that sea level rise discussion probably should be a very broad discussion, I think.
Well, let's see if we have any public input right at the moment, and conclude the hearing portion, and then sort of take the temperature of the commissioners one by one, do a little go round. Is that all right?
Mm-hmm.
Do we have anybody that would like to make a presentation to the commission?
Mr. Chair, we have nobody in attendance from the public.
Thank you. In that case, we will close the public hearing portion of this meeting. Can we just do a little quick go around and get a sense for what direction people would like to go with this? I don't have a particular axe to grind or religion involved here, so I'm curious to see what people have to say. Dr. Martin, you're thinking.
Thinking that I agree with Mr. Molyneux. If we kept talking about sea level rise for the next 50 years, I think we'd have different experts that would have different opinions, and I'm not so sure what would be accomplished with prolonging that. So for me, following the advice of our staff, moving from 1 foot to 2 foot, I'm fine with doing that. Just adopting as recommended with the 1 foot to 2 foot, because I don't think having more discussions about sea level rise is going to make us experts, and I think experts are all going to say different things.
Ms. Ruther?
Yeah, I mean, I think global warming's coming and we should get ready. My thing I'm having trouble wrapping my head around is like during the presentation, this is a very small portion of property that are actually going to be affected. And, you know, if you ever have a hard decision in life, you always put your pros and your cons and try to weigh them. And in my head, I don't know. I mean, I think the global issue of global warming is way bigger, and it's not even in the like, you know, the scope of this. So I'm not sure that opening that up is a great idea. On the same hand, I think we are arguing over something that's not going to make a huge amount of difference. So I'm totally fine with between 1 to 2 feet. I just don't think it's going to make or break the city's response to climate change. It almost, I mean, part of me seems like it's like that small area, like I don't even know what it's zoned or what would possibly be developed or what would be the unintended consequences. I'm like, we've spent so much time on this big global stuff that I'm having a hard time getting it down to how does that actually affect these few properties, and does that matter? So I'm kind of good either way.
Thank you. Mr. Jaretzky.
I'm going along with Dr. Martin's recommendation. Let's keep it simple with what we can really deal with, and then revisit it if somewhere down the road any of us are around and the sea levels have risen to a point where we need to be alarmed.
Mr. Graff. You're muted. Mr. Graff, thank you.
Yep. Hey, if I could see into the future, I would be playing the lottery a lot more often. I agree. Everything that we're trying to base this off of is based on probabilities. I think we should bring our attention back to the actual document, the AMC document. I think we should all go back and look at paragraph 2, the statement of purpose. I don't see anywhere in that statement of purpose where it calls out climate change and how we need to try to anticipate climate change. What it talks about is protecting human life, trying to minimize the expenditure of public money for rescue purposes. You know, I used to always scratch my head when I lived on the East Coast, watching all the homes get washed away on the Eastern Seaboard every time there was a huge storm. And you know what always happened every other year? Those homes were rebuilt because people buy insurance. You know, my biggest concern here is we're going to make a decision on data that isn't necessarily up to date enough to know what the impacts are going to be next month or next year. I think we should hold off increasing the BFE. I think we should take Mr. Meismer's recommendation, submit the document or what needs to be sent to ecology to meet the 31 March requirement, and then come back and look at this, but more focused on what the real statement of purpose is, not on whether we're going to be able to predict the impact of climate change. With the caveat to the city council that we're making a recommendation that we make no changes until we study this further, so that, like Jack brought up, they don't go through the same evolution and perhaps come up with the same decision.
Thank you. Mr. Molina.
Well, I think it's fairly clear where I stand. I think we should forward this to the council with a recommendation from 1 to 2 feet. We can always come back and revisit it. And if we're going to be forwarding this to the council now, that needs and purpose statement is going to go as written. So I move that we move forward. Oh, that wasn't meant as a
motion?
as a motion. I'm sorry.
I second it.
Mr. Curtis.
I want to clarify, I hope that Mr. Friesinger didn't take my previous comment as a personal dig at his presentation or his public speaking. That wasn't at all. It was more a commentary on what we've all hit on tonight, which is you can go to University of Illinois or University of Washington. It doesn't matter. I pull your data. Although I think it's interesting that Illinois is landlocked with the exception of a lake. But, you can go to pick your university and pick your data set, and it's going to yield a different answer. What I think is unchallengeable is that sea level is rising. It's a matter of at what rate and over what period of time. And then what does that mean for us as a committee that makes a recommendation to council. I could be comfortable with either of the potential proposals. I will simply add that if this goes forward as is, and again, with all respect to, is it Dr. Friesinger? Mr. Friesinger? That presentation, the way that the data is presented and the way that the charts are laid out leaves, I think it creates a lot more questions than are maybe necessary. And so maybe it's the way that those charts are presented or the way that data has been presented, but I might consider making as compelling of a case as Mr. Molyneux did earlier and definitive a case as he did, because I thought that was a really well-phrased argument that he made. Whereas the one that we were given tonight left a lot of room for questions and interpretation as we saw this conversation move toward. So it's a lot of words to say. If it's moving forward as is, my respectful recommendation would be to take a look at the presentation and potentially make it a bit more definitive, or at least a little bit more clear in how the data is presented. But I could also be convinced to save the council the work that they may end up asking for, and us do some more research on this.
And I have one question, Mr. Meisner. The plus 1 foot is an existing standard. Is that correct? If we propose 2 feet, it adds a foot to the current margin of error. Is that correct?
That's correct. The 1 foot that's currently required is a minimum required by the National Flood Insurance Program.
And now, in that sense, and looking at what little I've been able to divine from the trends, at least the ones that seem more reasonable, I'm inclined to go along with Dr. Martin and others and propose the 2 foot as just being a reasonable change, accounting for the fact that we do believe something's going to be happening with sea level. And if 1 foot is already required, why would we not raise it slightly to account for the probability, apparent probability that something's going to happen? So that's kind of
Raising it 100%. It's not it's 100%. You're increasing it by 100%.
So, do we have, we don't have a consensus. Do we have any motions? Mr. Jarecki, I see a hand.
I just have a question. It seems like we talked about this quite a few months ago. Mr. Meisner, it seemed like the question was, if we raise it by a foot, any thought to raising the height by a comparable amount, the height restriction?
Yeah, we talked about this a while back. So raising the height more than 35 foot, you get into a variance from the Department of Ecology because of shoreline issues. The maximum height from a Department of Ecology standpoint on the shoreline is 35 feet. And so that means a variance. It would also mean a variance through the city process. So you'd have to go through a hearings examiner, you'd have to go through the Department of Ecology. And my opinion is that it would be more than difficult to get a variance for that.
Thank you.
Mr. Curtis. You're muted.
I think by now I'd have that figured out. Mr. Meisner, just follow-up question. Let's say hypothetically in 30 years, the sea level rise has not occurred pick your model, has not occurred at that rate. Can a future planning commission and a future city council make adjustments in the opposite direction? Or is the assumption that it will always rise? It's just a matter of which rates?
Well, I think the assumption is that sea level will rise. It's just a matter of how much and when. But to answer the question, at any time, the city council can amend our development regulations, and they could remove that additional foot and go back to the minimum of 1 foot.
Well, I thought, Mr. Meisner, that you were gently suggesting that getting a decision made here would be preferable to kicking the can down the road, but it was possible to do that.
I don't think he's kicking the can down the road. I think he's giving it an opportunity, assuming the majority of us agree, that we forward status quo to the city council with the understanding that we, planning commission, want to research this further, so we have a better understanding so that when we do make a recommendation, whether it's 2 feet, 3 feet, or we maintain the 1 foot, it's from an educated stance. And I'm not suggesting that we learn about climate change and we all become climate change experts, nor we become statisticians and understand probability models. What I'm suggesting, though, is I'm not convinced, based on the maps that we were shown, based on the likelihood of this impacting maybe more than 3 properties, whether it's worth the effort to change it from 1 foot to 2 foot until we understand what the new maps are going to have and what impact those will have on further properties. And from what Mr. Meisner suggested, it could have a substantial impact that we haven't taken into consideration yet.
Mr. Molyneux.
But I go back to the original question that Mr. Meisner raised is, when will we ever see those maps? They've been in already multiple years in preparation and with absolutely no timeline for completion.
Yes, sir, and I understand that, but I bet you we could use the same probability models that we were shown about what the expectation is on sea level rise to suggest that that's when we're going to see those maps, right? Probably going to be a 99, a 50, and a 1% probability, high, low, based on the level of effort that the NOAA puts into developing those maps, and it could be anywhere between 2030 and 2100.
Dr. Martin.
I have a question for our 2 staff members that are present, Mr. Meisner and Mr. Freisinger. Is that how you say your name? I'm sorry.
It's Freisinger,
Freisinger.
but that's close enough.
So you're the staff people, you are the experts. If you were building a house by the water, would you raise it 1 foot or would you raise it 2 feet?
Well,
I'll answer from my perspective.
okay.
So if, in fact, I could afford to build a house on the shoreline, I'm going to take the worst case scenario under consideration. I'm going to build that 2 foot above.
Thank you.
Because I've seen, when I say that though,
That line of argument has no bearing on this, because why? So just hear me out for a second, and I apologize for interrupting, but we're asking somebody who we're assuming is an expert in this, based on status quo, which is BFE +1, that they would add an extra foot. Why not give that same opportunity to all of the landowners in Anacortes by leaving it at BFE +1, educating them that there is a chance that their property could be engulfed with water, and then it's up to them and their insurance company to decide how much money they want to spend and how high they want to build their house.
my apologies, I overstepped my boundaries with my opinion.
No, what I'm asking for was your opinion, because that's why we pay you the big bucks. And I think it does matter. We have a recommendation from staff. You have looked more deeply than I know I have looked. I want to know what's your opinion, because that will help to sway my opinion.
So I will go back to what we have in your package from Geological Services and what information we had this evening. It is based on the various science that's out there. Sea level and climate change is going to happen. Do we know how much and when? No, I don't think we do. And so we're trying to look into the future a little bit to see what's happening And that's how we write code, is for the next 10 years. Oftentimes we will go back and amend the code within a couple of years, depending on what we've learned between 2 years ago and today. We're doing that now with some of our development regulations, especially in regards to daycare. You all have already seen a part of that. So is this something that's going to be set in stone for the next 20 years? No. It could change and even go up more. There could become evidence where it needs to be more. We don't know. The commissioners do have that opportunity to continue to talk about this and get additional expert information. I will tell you, I'm not an expert on sea level rise or climate change.
So I saw Mr. Molyneux and Ms. Ruther with their hands up. Go ahead.
If we make a motion to move this to the council, in no way does this, as I understand our processes, limit us in having a further discussion of this, continuing the discussion, but yet going ahead and forwarding it to council. With that said, I'd like to make a motion to send the ordinance to council with an increase in the base level elevation from 1 foot to 2 foot with a do pass recommendation.
Second.
Okay, and for motion made and seconded. Dr. Martin, your vote?
Aye.
Ms. Ruther?
Aye.
Mr. Jarecki?
Aye.
Mr. Graff?
No.
Mr. Molyneux?
Aye.
Mr. Curtis?
No.
And the chair votes yes. Motion passes.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Mr. Curtis.
if I may just add a bit of context there, especially to Mr. Molnar, I don't need convincing. So to the conversation about further debate, now that this vote has taken place, I don't need further conversation or debate to convince me that this is occurring. My no vote is based on the presentation that we were presented with tonight, and I think the one going to council needs to be better.
You wouldn't get an argument from me.
And I would support that. My questions earlier had to do a lot with the analysis that we were being presented with. I think the information was adequate to support the small change that we made. I would not have supported anything further than that.
I mean, in Mr. Fishinger's, I don't know how to pronounce your last name. In his defense, I would have liked to see more of a policy debate. That was what I was having a hard time, and I'm more of a policy person than the science person. He's not. I don't think policy is his expertise in his defense. So maybe that would just be like try to look at this from a policy perspective, rather than getting so like arguing over, probable numbers.
If I could suggest that when this goes to the council, part of the staff presentation should probably reflect the extent to which this was debated here, and that there were some very, very good issues brought up that I think the council should be aware of when they're making their deliberations. Would that be possible?
Mr. Chair, I'll see what I can do to add some of the conversations, debate this evening into the findings that will be moving forward to the City Council.
Thank you, sir. Any other comments for the good of the order?
Mr. Chair, one last comment, if I may.
Sure.
I really enjoyed this evening's debate. It was great. Thank you all.
I kind of like meetings where there's some differences of opinion and we thrash things out.
Yeah,
That's
it was
what we're here
fun.
for. With that being said, I think we'll bring this meeting to a close. And quick question about the 16th again. That will be an in-person, mass optional. One commission member is going to be out of town, and I want to make sure that, is it Mr. Curtis, I believe?
I'll be dialing in from sunny San Diego.
Want to make sure that he has access to remotely participate. If we can let the staff know that we don't want to lose that function. Thank you very much, everybody, and good work tonight.
Thank you all.
Good night.